Goeienaand, welkom by Fokus. Ek is Lenet Francis. Augustus maand is amper verby, wat hopelik beteken die lente is net om die draai. Volgens nuwe inligting wat die week deur Statistiek Suid-Afrika bekend gemaak is armoede aan die toeneem in Suid-Afrika. Statistiek Suid-Afrika het navorsing gedoen oor armoede tendense tussen 2006 en 2015. Bykans 14 miljoen mense leef in uiterste armoede. Dit beteken hulle leef van R440 per maand of selfs minder. Boonop leef meer as 55% van alle Suid-Afrikaners nou in armoede. Maar wat het hiertoe aanduiding gegee en hoe vergelyk armoede in Suid-Afrika met die res van die wêreld? Om die saak te bespreek, praat ons nou met die politieke kenner Aubrey Mashiki en die ekonoom Mike Schuessler van economist.co.za. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. So break it down for us, Mike, to understand the true extent of poverty in South Africa.
Well, when we look at something called food poverty, which is a very low poverty level, we're looking at about 25% of the population. That's at 17 Rand a day. And although the World Bank talks about absolute poverty at 12 Rand a day, roughly in South African terms, it says to us that that's roughly where the World Bank would have lower figures for us. If we then look at the upper poverty level line that they've also introduced to us, that means it's around 35 Rand, nearly 36 Rand a day. And that's when people can buy clothes and housing and so on. And then we also have various others, but one of them is a multi-dimensional poverty, which also looks at about 25% of the population. But that would include not just the person's salary, that would include then the feeding program that the children have at school, that they get free education, that they get electricity, that people have water, piped water, and the lot. And that puts it into sort of South African terms. In world terms, what we've seen is that less than 17% of the world's population is now in absolute poverty. That's at 12 Rand a day in South African terms. And that more or less I would say is where South Africa is, give and take a few percentage points either way. And that's come down tremendously. It's even come down in absolute numbers, while the population growth in the world has gone from about 5 billion to about 7.5 billion. That has come down from roughly about 1.6 billion to about 1.3 billion. So, you know, whereas one would have expected if those levels were the same, it to be over 2 billion. It's definitely come down in the last 30 years or so. And if one looks further back, I think we've come down from about 40% of the world population living in poverty in the last, say, 35, 40 years to where we are today with 17%, less than half of that percentage living in poverty. And as I said, in South Africa, the poverty levels have gone up since 2011. But if we look back to 2006 and 2002, we are looking at poverty having declined quite dramatically, both male, female, whatever side. We've seen a lot of poverty drop, and that's probably due to social grants to some extent, but it's also due when we look at the multidimensional level, where we have a lot more people on electricity, a lot more people with piped water, and a lot of feeding schemes.
Well, you know what's interesting to me about numbers is the fact that statistics are important, especially when it comes to planning. But if we were to walk into every house, into every shack, into every dwelling in South Africa, I do have the sense that statistics would not paint the true picture of the well-being of South Africans. So while I don't deny that we need numbers to understand the lived reality of South Africans, and therefore on that basis plan how we ameliorate their social and economic conditions, I do have some skepticism about an over-reliance on numbers and what we make numbers make us tell us, which may not be a story that is lived by the ordinary South African. Let's look at Brexit, for instance. It's very clear that worldwide, the real problem is inequality. And Brexit happens as a rebellion against inequality. The same thing happens with the emergence of Trump or the Trump phenomenon. It's a rebellion against inequality. And South Africa is no exception when it comes to that, that inequality is a problem. The two intractable problems we have over and above inequality are poverty and unemployment. For instance, we have many who are employed but are poor. And sometimes we don't make that connection, that there are many South Africans who are in jobs but are poor.
So where would the working poor, would they be the upper poverty levels? Where would they fall?
They would definitely fall in the upper poverty levels or beyond that, because if you, depends how you define it, but if you look at South Africans, only 4 out of 10 adults work. So if we have 55% of our total population and we say households are all the same, then it says to us that it's all likelihood the people that are in work are not part of the ultimate poor. It's the unemployed that are really part of the poor. But, you know, you get different sorts of work. So only 3 out of 10 adults in South Africa have a formal sector job. And if we look at that, that also gives us an indication as to what's happening here, because 1 out of 10 work either in domestic households or they work in informal employment. And obviously, in most cases, informal employment is not as well paid. And we know in South Africa that the biggest problem that we have, I really do believe, is that 36%, just over that, of all adults do not have a job. And if you've and would like to have a job, they might have given up searching for one, but that's nearly as many people as are in a job, and especially the formal sector. So if you look at the formal sector being around 10 million, there's 9.3 million people that do not have a job. And then there's that 5 million people that are, let's call it self-employed, informal sector very often, and domestic sectors that are in between. For lack of a better, they're in the middle of this whole consortium.
There is another problem, however, that comes out of this SABC study, that the poorest cohort are those who are 17 and younger.
Yes,
and
that 27.7%
and that has implications for the future. Africa and South Africa have very young populations. According to the 2011 census, the median age in the population as a whole is 25, and among so-called black Africans is 21. So which means if this cohort is the poorest, we need a set of policies that will take them out of poverty, because this is about the future and what the future will look like in social and economic terms. And if you're 24 and you still don't have a job, the likelihood is that it's either going to be very difficult or you will never find a job. That is another problem in addition to this young cohort of South Africans.
Let's talk about that after the break, especially when we look at who's failing whom in this scenario. Net hierna sit ons die gesprek voort. Bly gerus ingeskakel. Dit raak ons almal. Ons praat vanaand oor armoede in Suid-Afrika en meer spesifiek oor Statistiek Suid-Afrika se jongste bevindinge wat aandui dat Suid-Afrikaners armer word. Ons gaste is die politieke kenner Aubrey Mashiki en die ekonoom Mike Schuessler. If we talk about a 14-year high unemployment rate and about 40% are young people, then how optimistic can we afford to be? Aubrey was mentioning before the break the implications of our future then.
Well, I think, first of all, young people around the world are finding it difficult to get into jobs, first of all. And the second thing I think what we need to look at is that we have a very high number of people that are staying in single-parent households. And it's very much more difficult for single-parent households to maintain a lifestyle, for example. And South Africa has 52% of its children staying in single woman-headed households. That's the highest number in the world. So that is one of the bigger problems that we have. We also need to look at a much broader thing than just youth, Because if we go and look at this, it's black African, very often female are the on the unemployed and the poor, and they're in rural areas. So it says to me, if I look at South Africa, I don't need to concentrate all my efforts on Gauteng or on the Western Cape. I need to start concentrating it in where people are, in the rural areas. And very often in the rural areas, people have certain stuff. We have a very high home ownership in South Africa. So people have houses. Some of them don't own the houses, but they have an RDP house. So we need to get the jobs closer to them. Then that will lower the transport costs. We need to find a way to bring that into the economy, the people that are far away from the center of the economy. Because I think often we get stuck in Gauteng or in the richer city areas, be it Durban, Pinetown and so forth, where we don't quite have an idea of what's going on in the rural areas. And I think that is where we can look at these things as well, because that's also part of the thing, apart from being youth. And that's also very often where sometimes our education lacks. And the citizen...
Mike is correct. We cannot only focus on Gauteng, but we must also bear in mind that the majority of South Africans are now in urban areas, not in rural areas. So while it is true that poverty, or those who bear the brunt of poverty are those who are black, are those who are female, and are those who are in rural areas, these categories of South Africans increasingly find themselves in urban areas, which means going forward, if there are no interventions or the interventions do not work, poverty becomes an urban phenomenon. And at some point may even become more of an urban phenomenon than it is of a rural phenomenon.
So how did we get here, Aubrey? Who's been failing whom? Do we blame government? Do we blame policymakers? We've had the National Developing Plan and not much has come of that. So who has to take responsibility for people going to bed hungry?
Well, there's a combination of reasons. Obviously, our history is the foundation of what we find today. The structure of our economy is another problem. And how the post-apartheid state has responded or not responded to these social and economic relations is another problem. So, which means if we are to look at the state of poverty today, politically, if you are in the ruling party, you will want to shift the blame by suggesting that the absence of what they call radical economic transformation must be blamed on the past or the not white monopoly capital, except what the state has failed to do. If you're sitting in the economic freedom fighters, this is sort of a good story for you politically, because you can leverage that story to advantage and make promises, populist or otherwise, to voters about how we are going to ameliorate these conditions. But I think former President Thabo Mbeki is correct that another factor is lack of leadership. And therefore, with lack of leadership has come a lack of answers, particularly when it comes to the economy. So the problem with the state under the leadership of the ANC is not just lack of leadership, but it's also a lack of technical capacity and know-how about how to turn around the performance of the economy.
If I can come in here, I think if one goes back to 2002 and we just look at the people that sometimes go hungry to bed, it was around 30% of our population. Today, it's around 15 or just below 15. But it actually reached that level in 2007 and 2008. And yes, there was the crisis when it went up a bit, but it came back down. And it stayed the same virtually, and in the last while increased ever so slightly. But it says to you that the major poverty reduction in South Africa happened about 2002 to 2008 on that low score, if I can call it that.
So what did we do right then? And where did we deviate from what we were doing?
I think two things happened. I think we must remember that the world was booming and we had a commodity boom. So we had a lot of that. And I think business as such felt more certain. And we were, even though people said it was a jobless growth, the numbers that we're getting now suggest that there was already then some growth that we didn't pick up in the job numbers. And I think that we had a bit of growth. We were spreading a lot more of the ability in the economy or the wealth that was created. And today we're not doing that. I don't think that there's one magic wand that will fix all of this anyway. Okay. But I think ultimately we are in a situation where the leadership, as Aubrey says, is probably a lot less capable than it was in the previous dispensation.
Let's just hold that thought, Aubrey. Net hierna kan ons daaroor verder gesels. Bly gerus ingeskakel. Daar is nog baie vrae. Ons is nou terug. Moenie weggaan nie. Welkom terug. Armoede in Suid-Afrika het weer toegeneem, maar wat kan gedoen word om die situasie om te keer en is dit werklik moontlik? Ons praat met die politieke kenner Aubrey Mashiki en die ekonom Mike Schuessler. En ek weet Aubrey, you wanted to respond to what Mike was saying.
Well, I wanted to talk about the period prior to the financial crisis when we did have some growth on the back of the commodity boom. But that also coincided with the fact that the benefits of that growth did not extend significantly to those who are working class and those who are poor. But when we look at what we do going forward, I think we need to look at the orientation of the state, first of all. Now, remember that we have a phenomenon in which poverty is being feminized. And because poverty is being feminized, there is an extent to which the state, like the state in Sweden, must adopt a feminist stance. You mainstream gender and gender equality in your policy processes to make sure that you attack the poverty of women in that way.
So create more jobs for women where they'll be able to take care of their families, particularly in some of those areas, either urban or rural, where they contribute to a bigger extent.
You make interventions in those areas of the lives of women that are responsible for their poverty, that will ameliorate their social and economic conditions. And the state needs to have an anti-patriarchal stance for it to adopt such a stance in favor of gender equality. But you are not going to get there unless you find a cure for the low levels of trust in South Africa. First of all, between those who govern and those who are governed. Secondly, between the private sector and the public sector, the state and the private sector. Because if you are going to turn what is in the National Development Plan into a plan, because the NDP is not a plan, if you are going to turn that into a plan and do the technocratic work that is necessary to turn it into a plan, you need to unite all these social partners behind a common vision for the future of the economy and the future of the country.
I think, you know, to be more practical, I would say if you want to intervene in the lives of women, you would make sure that creches are available that take care of their children and give them some sort of son and involve them in maybe the food schemes that present food to the poorest children and so on. But I think on another practical level, I agree with Aubrey about the trust between the various sectors in South Africa, which is really broken down. But I think what's more important now is that we don't have anti-stances, that we have pro-stances. So we should have a pro-rural policy that looks at how do we subsidize firms and things in the rural areas. And we did that before, and we can do that again without putting the apartheid connotations to it, but we have industrialized parks, or we did. And that would then alleviate the poverty in those sort of areas. And I think that's something that we need to look at, giving, incentivizing the private sector to go to those areas within the rules of the WTO and the like. And we need to look at how we can maybe make the change from agriculture, because that's one quick way of creating a lot of jobs in the rural areas, and the whole supply chain and bringing those things into world markets and getting us there, the packaging, the logistics, everything that goes together with that. I think those are practical solutions in those areas, because I think overall those are the places where we can have, let's call it pro-interventions, when we've got something more positive to do and to put it together than we do at this moment in time. It doesn't help having just a generalized industrial program. We need to have industrial program and services program or whatever that also looks at the rural areas, looks at the black female, looks at young people, how do we employ them, what sort of training interventions we need, and in which places.
So thus far, do you both agree that our interventions have relied too much on social grants, for example, and that we have not diversified our approach?
I agree, but I also agree that without the social grants, there would be a revolution in this country, because the levels of poverty would be much higher. What we must not do, though, when we tackle the problem of the feminization of poverty in this country, is to be paternalistic in the interventions we adopt. In other words, we must not come with solutions that keep women to the peripheries of economic activity by limiting them to activities such as food gardens and things like that. Ultimately, the policies we adopt must be policies that move women from the periphery to the center of the economy as part of the broader approach of restructuring the economy.
Mike, you've got about 30 seconds. Have we left this too late?
Well, what I'm disappointed about, I don't think it's left too late. I'm disappointed about the direction it's taken in the last 4 years. I think we were improving and we needed to actually carry on improving, and we didn't.
Winds of change, that's what we need. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Waardeer julle tyd vanaand. Dis ongelukkig ook al vir vanaand. Ons is wel volgende Sondag aand om 6:00 terug hier op SABC 2. Laat weet ons gerus wat jy dink self van vanaand se gesprek. Stuur gerus jou kommentaar, jou tweets en jou voorstelle. Jy kan dit e-pos na fokus@sabc.co.za. Jy kan ook ons Facebookblad op Facebook besoek. Dis nou Fokusblad. Soek onder by Fokus SABC en volg ons ook op Twitter by Fokus ZA. Ons hoop jy het vanaand se gesprek geniet en waardeer, en ons wag vir daardie terugvoer. Vrede en voorspoed vir die komende week. Ons gesels weer volgende Sondag aand om 6:00. Onthou jou afspraak, ons hoop dit is 'n wonderlike week. Mooi bly.